Welcome to the studio. Pull up a chair because today we're going to be painting these whimsical snails using gorgeous swirl brushstrokes. It's very easy, and I've prepared a PDF resource guide for you to follow along with the supplies as well as the steps and a few reference photos for you to practice from. Now let's make some magic. Here's a quick overview of the supplies we'll be using. I am using this palette from Christy Rice. I have loved it so much, you can tell from all those little dimples. I'll be using the blue and the brown. She has amazing names for them, but I cannot recall them right now. I also have this palette from Arteza. It is shimmer watercolor, and we'll be using this at the end for some shimmer details. Some gold ink and a dip pen so that we can create these beautiful marks towards the end. A heat gun because this whole process is wet on dry. And then for paper, I'm using this block from Layton, and it's 5x7, and then 2 brushes. And I will tell you that depending on the paper that you choose to use, it influences what brush size you use. I have here the 5 and what I believe is a 1 because I have found that that's the size that works well for this paper. If you want to create something smaller like these ACO cards, you want to start with a smaller brush, perhaps a 3 or 4, but feel free to experiment and see what works for you. And then of course, water. And I think I already mentioned the heat gun. So let's get started with our first layer. In the resource guide, you will find a photo of this sketch. It is very simple, but it was my way to show you how we're going to be doing our brush strokes. So we'll be doing a series of 3 spirals to make that gorgeous shell, and then the body for the snail. And so feel free to experiment. This is just what I'm using, so you can start from here and then have fun exploring different techniques. So we'll start, you can pick whether you start with the body or the shell. I like to start with the shell. I'll be starting with the biggest spiral first and then work my way up to that tiny spiral at the top. And then I'll come back in and do the body of the snail. First, I'm gonna get my brush nice and wet and then dip it into that blue. Just pick up some of that pigment, and I wanna make sure that my brush is as wet as possible so that it glides easily on the paper. I like to start the swirl around here so that I have plenty of space for the snail's body. And so following our diagram, we're gonna start very heavy with the brush, and then just turn, creating that spiral. And then release pressure and come down so you get that nice little point. I'm gonna come back in again with a little bit more pigment. And when you put on a bit of pressure on your brush, you're gonna get this really nice texture where you've got those dry edges. Now our medium spiral. And our baby spiral. And you can feel free to switch to a smaller brush. I should have done that here, this smaller one. And then feel free to come back in and add a few more brush strokes just to accentuate that movement. Now that our brush is clean, we're going to pick up some of that brown. And following the sketch, the thin tail, and then you put more pressure here so that the belly of the brush is completely touching the paper. And then you're following that spiral that you laid down for that larger shell. And then you turn your brush like this. For the head of the snail, grabbing a little bit more pigment and going over that first pass that we did. And then I'm going to put 1 brush stroke here for the belly of the snail. And then leave a trail, a light trail for the antenna. Okay, and now we're gonna dry this. Now that this is dry, we're gonna come back in with the second layer of details using those same two colors that you used for that first layer. And I'm going to start with my shells, and my brush is decently wet, not as wet as that first pass because there's still water in my well of blue. So I'm just gonna be pulling from there because I want this to be a darker layer. And you're just going over and either defining that spiral that you did on the first pass or adding some marks to the center of those shells. I like to come in and define the outer edge and then come back in and add a few smaller strokes. You can also add some dots for texture. And I really like this edge that came out of that brush stroke that had the dry edges. So I'm going to try to leave that as intact as possible and focus on the center. This is the perfect opportunity to switch to a smaller brush, but I'm continuing to use the number 5, particularly for the smaller swirl to get the littlest details. I'm just being very careful wherever I want a smaller brush stroke just to use that tapered edge. And I just painted my little mark that I love, which is a heart. I feel like the painting gets an extra burst of joy when I add it, but for you, it could be that it's not a heart. It could be that along your explorations, you find a mark that you feel expresses who you are and what brings you joy. So I encourage you to explore and see what that mark becomes for you. And I'm just continuing to add brush strokes here wherever I feel that they are necessary, particularly to the edges. I want a little bit of a darker concentration of the pigment, but feel free to explore and see what brings you joy. All right, now we're going to add markings to our snail, again using that same color. And I like to start at the tip and work my way up so that there's a darker concentration of the pigment close to that edge of that shell so that there's a larger contrast between the snail and the shell. And then now we can add a little bit more detail to our antennae, adding the little dots and then adding a thicker stroke to that antennae. Now I'm coming in with the tip of the brush to add little dots as freckles to the body, and then 2 darker brush strokes on the belly just to define that a little bit more. And then I'm just adding a few lines to give a little bit of edge definition to that belly and a few more freckles. I'm being intentional about not adding a lot of details here because I want to add a few more using shimmer and gold ink in our next step. Now we're going to dry this again before we add some shimmer. Make sure you give your shimmer watercolor plenty of time to activate because they work best when they have a little bit of time to sit with water on them. And I'm just going to be using a blue and a brown to bring a little bit of magical details to the shell and the snail's body. And I'm being very loose and working very quickly because I don't want to cover the whole shell with shimmer, just a few of the lighter edges. And this is an area where you can explore further and work with different colors of shimmer. I just wanted to keep this really muted so that when I come in with the gold details, those really pop. This is one of those layers where you're trusting the process because when you're adding shimmer, you can't tell too much what is actually happening, but wait until it dries and we remove it from the pad and you're going to be able to catch all those little details. Now for the snail's body, I'm just adding shimmer to the darkest areas. I'm leaving the existing freckles alone because they are quite small, but I am going to come in and add a few more freckles towards that middle top section and add a few elongated marks just to give a little bit more whimsy to the snail. Now, before we add the final touch with the gold ink, we're going to dry this one more time because we don't want that gold ink to get into the wet shimmer paint and smear. I don't know if this tip applies to all acrylic gold inks, but the ones that I have had, if they've been sitting for a while, you want to just shake them up so that they get mixed up again and then they're ready to use. One of the ways that I like to use the dip pen is by laying it almost flat so that the tip creates that elongated edge that you're seeing in that first mark that I made, and then let go a little bit of the pressure so you get a nice little line that kind of fades, and that kind of helps accentuate those swirls that we made towards the edges and the center of the spirals. On that larger spiral, I did add a few towards the center because it does cover a larger area, but then on the other two smaller shells, I just added it to the edges so that it has a little bit of a gold detail there. And I'm also going to add another gold heart because I told you I find that hearts are joyful. The larger spiral is where you'll find lots of room for exploration. I found that this area here was feeling like it needed a little bit more detail, so I came in and added some gold dots just to fill in some of that space. The more that you explore, the more you're going to become more familiar with the things that you find pleasing when it comes to repetition, rhythm, and the balance of white space and detail. Once I finish adding these final dots, I'm going to dry this one more time before I peel it off the block, and I'm going to be using a palette knife. It has a little indent opening here, and then you just go along the edge, gently peeling the glued edge, and it is always flawless. That's why I love this paper pad. And now we're going to get the peek at all those beautiful little details we added. And here we have our whimsical snail with all those magical details with the shimmer watercolor and the acrylic gold ink. I hope you found a lot of joy painting these snails, and I hope that it has inspired your curiosity to continue exploring more. I would love to see the snails that you paint. If you are watching this on YouTube, please post it in the community tab. And if you're watching on Facebook, you can feel free to share a photo of your snail in the comments. Thank you so much for joining me here in the studio. Until next time, stay wild.